Chapter 2. Intentionality. I can think about prime numbers or faraway galaxies, imagine unicorns, taste chamomile tea, fear dementors, remember events from my childhood, or recognize a photo of the Danish queen. It would consequently be a fundamental mischaracterization of my experiential life if one were to think of it simply as an amalgam of more or less intense internal sensations and feeling states. When we see, hear, remember, imagine, think, hate, or fear, our seeing, hearing, remembering, imagining, thinking, hating, and fearing is about something. Consciousness has a directedness to it. It is a consciousness of something. It is characterized by intentionality. Consciousness is not concerned or preoccupied with itself, but is rather by nature self-transcending. For the phenomenologists, intentionality is the generic term for this pointing beyond itself proper to consciousness. It is important not to confuse this sense of the term with the more familiar sense of intentionality as having a purpose in mind when one acts. Although the notion of intentionality has a long history that stretches back at least as far as Aristotle, and although it has played a central role in medieval philosophy, it was subjected to a major analysis in what is often considered the first major work in phenomenology, Husserl's Logical Investigations. It was also a topic that Husserl kept working on for the rest of his life. Oh no, I need to make sure the microphone is on. Okay, good. Woo! Why was the topic deemed to be of crucial importance? Because its investigation allowed for a clarification of the connection as well of the difference between experiential subjectivity and worldly objects. In being intentional, consciousness is not self-enclosed, but primarily occupied with objects and events that by nature are utterly different from consciousness itself. The birthday cake that I perceive is quite different from my perception of it. The birthday cake weighs 3 kilograms, can be eaten, and can be used in a clowning act. My experience of the cake, by contrast, does not weigh anything, cannot be eaten, and cannot hit anybody in the face. Excuse me. And whereas the cake is not of or about anything, the perception of the cake is exactly about something, namely the cake. It is customary to speak of intentionality as being aspectual or perspectival. Oh, aspectual. That's right. One is never conscious of an object simpliciter. One is always conscious of an object in a particular way, be it from a certain perspective or under a particular description. The object is always presented in a certain way to the subject. I might think of my smartphone as a means of communication, as a present I received from a friend, as an efficient way to store my music, or as a source of irritation because it doesn't work properly, etc. But apart from intending different properties of the object, apart from varying what the object that is intended is presented as, one might also vary the very form of presentation itself. Instead of perceiving a table, I can also imagine it, judge it, remember it, etc. Needless to say, the same object can be intended in different ways, and the same type of intentionality can target different objects. It is possible to doubt that the financial crisis will continue, to doubt that the election was fair, or to doubt that the climate crisis is fake news, just as it is possible to see that it rains, imagine that it rains, or deny that it rains. Each type of intentional experience, be it a perception, an imagining, a desiring, a remembering, etc., is directed at its object in a distinctive way. A central phenomenological task is to analyze these differences in detail, and to map out the way they are systematically interrelated. Perception and pictures. In his classical analysis, Husserl emphasized the primacy of perceptual intentionality. Consider the following comparison. We might discuss which cake to buy for the birthday party. Should it be an Othello cake or a Sacerdote? We can think and talk and be conscious of these cakes even in their absence, i.e., even when they are not to be found in our spatial vicinity. We might also study a photo of the Othello cake in order to discover more details about its composition and look. We remain directed at the same type of cake as before, but it has now gained a pictorial presence. Finally, we might buy or bake the cake, and see and taste it. In all three cases, we are directed at the very same type of cake, but the way the cake shows itself in the three cases is quite different. One possibility is to rank the intentional acts according to their ability to give us the object as directly and originally as possible. Consider the linguistic acts. When we simply think and talk about the cake is certainly the object of our reference. It is the cake we are thinking and talking about, but it is not given in any intuitive manner. The pictorial acts have a certain intuitive content, but like the linguistic acts, they intend the object indirectly, whereas the linguistic acts intend the object via conventional representations, linguistic signs. The pictorial acts intend the object via a representation, picture, that bears a certain similarity. Oh, frick. There's someone mowing the grass near the beach. Yeah, I'm gonna have to move, aren't I? I'm definitely gonna have to move. Well, that's annoying. Maybe they just won't come over here. That would be extra nice. Go the other way, guy. Alright, anyways. Oh, yeah. They're coming. They're flying by. Well, not really flying, but... Alright, one possibility. That's where we're at, and I will continue... Oh, they went the other way. Alright, I'm just going to continue. One possibility is to rank the intentional acts according to their ability to give us the object as directly and originally as possible. Consider first linguistic acts. When we simply think and talk about the cake is certainly the object of our reference. It is the cake we are thinking and talking about, but it is not given in any intuitive manner. The pictorial acts have a certain intuitive content, but like the linguistic acts, they intend the object indirectly. Time to roll up that window. Just block some of the sound. That's a little better. Spook. Alright. Whereas the linguistic acts intend the object via conventional representation, linguistic signs, the pictorial acts intend the object via a representation, picture, that bears a certain similarity to the object. It is only perceptual acts that give us the object directly. It is this type of intention which, according to Husserl, provides us with the object itself in its bodily presence. That is perceptual acts. Those are the intentions that do this. Huh. Interesting. I guess these different acts. Now I have horizons from that other thing I read in my head, so I'm guessing like the linguistic acts involved some horizon of language that cannot be represented within the horizon of pictorial. And I guess perceptual. I don't know what the difference in these horizons are. If they are horizons. I'm gonna highlight this so I can ask someone about it. Highlight, you're purple. The claim, however, is not merely that perceptual intentionality presents us with the object in a privileged manner. Again, compare talking about flying in a hot air balloon, seeing a video about it, or experiencing it yourself. The claim is also that perceptual intentionality is more basic than other complex forms of intentionality, such as recollection or pictorial intentionality. You have no idea what the frick a pictorial is. Anyways. When we have episodic memories, when we remember what we had for breakfast earlier today, we are remembering prior perceptual experiences. To that extent, recollection is founded upon and presupposes perception. When we look at pictures and see depicted objects, things get even more complicated. Consider the following example. Oh, maybe that's what it means, the reference of an image. Okay. Cool. Consider the following example. I am visiting the Museum of Fine Arts in Vienna and now stand in front of Dürer's portrait of Emperor Maximilian. What object am I directed at? I can attend the image thing, i.e. the portrait as a physical object, that is, as a framed canvas with some layers of paint. I can attend the image object, i.e. the very pictorial representation and its aesthetic qualities, and consider how successful Dürer's depiction is. Or I can attend to the image subject, i.e. that which is depicted. Normally, our attention is at first drawn to the latter. I might be fascinated by Maximilian's distinct profile, by his luxurious dress, or by the pomegranate he is holding in his left hand. Oop, got a lawnmower going. Cool. Just gonna give that a moment. Stroll up the fucking window. Be hot for a moment. This might seem easy and straightforward, but is in fact no small accomplishment, since it involves a fairly complex stratified form of intentionality. To see why, consider what it means for something to be and function as an image of something else. How come one object depicts another object? Whereas there is no intrinsic relation between the sign and that which it signifies, the picture supposedly has certain intrinsic qualities that constrains what it can be said to depict. When combined in the right manner, the 5 letters CHAIR refer to a chair, but this reference is purely conventional, and might have been different. In Danish, the relevant letters are STOL. By contrast, we cannot without further ado decide that Dürer's portrait depicts a can of Heinz tomato soup. It would be a mistake, however, to think that the mere presence of a certain similarity makes one object depict another object. Regardless of how much the two things look alike, it does not make one into a picture or an image of the other. 2 blades of grass may look quite alike, but that does not make one into a picture of the other. Whereas resemblance is... That's kind of funny, though, because people do say, like, spit an image of, you know? Anyway. And whereas resemblance is a reciprocal relation, this is not the case for representation. The portrait is a picture of Maximilian, but Maximilian does not depict or represent the picture. According to Husserl's analysis of pictorial intentionality, one physical object can only come to function as a picture of something else, can only come to depict something else if it is apprehended in a specific way by the spectator. To phrase it somewhat paradoxically, in order to see what is depicted in the picture, we both have to see and not see that which is physically in front of us. We have to perceive the frame of canvas, but we also have to transcend what is physically present in front of us in order to allow the depicted to appear pictorially. That's cool. In a way, the frame functions as a kind of window into a pictorial world. An everyday example can confirm this. If you are reading the newspaper and come across a photo of Macron, you are normally conscious of Macron. He is the object of your attention. But if the photo qua image object is very fuzzy and pixelated, it might force itself upon your attention, even in the best circumstances. However, pictorial intentionality remains mediated and involves a peripheral awareness of the image thing. If it did not, we would be experiencing the depicted as actually present and would consequently be having an illusion. Bam, bam, bam. Representation and causality. The intentionality of consciousness is no simple matter, but a multifaceted, multi-layered scaffold. Regardless of whether we are talking about a simple case of perceptual intentionality or a complex case where we remember having visited a pictorial gallery where we saw X's depiction of Y, consciousness remains outward directed, concerned and occupied with objects and events different from itself. But how is this possible? How is it that the mind can perform this extraordinary feat? On a view that the phenomenologists reject, experiences are in and of themselves subjective happenings with no immediate bearing on the world outside. If one adheres to such an such a conception, the typical claim has then been that one needs to introduce some kind of interface between the mind and the world in order to understand and explain intentionality. If I am looking at the cake might be what I am conscious of, but this can hardly mean that the cake qua physical object is literally present in my consciousness. Rather, the cake is affecting my sensory apparatus, and as a result of this causal impact, a mental representation of the cake arises in consciousness. On such an account, ordinary perception consequently implies two different entities, the extramental object and the intramental representation, and my access to the former is mediated and enabled by the latter. This construal is rejected by all phenomenologists, however. Let me here just mention two of their criticisms. The first criticism targets the introduction of a representational mediation. The second, the attempt to explain intentionality on the basis of causality. Representationalism notoriously courts skepticism. Why should awareness of one thing, an inner object, enable awareness of a quite different thing, an external object? And how should we ever be in position to determine whether that object, or whether that which is internally accessible, actually represents something external? After all, it is not as if we can step outside of our consciousness from time to time, in order then to compare what is inside with what is outside. In addition, if we actually examine our perceptual experience, we should realize that it does not confront us with the pictures or signs of objects, except, of course, insofar as we are perceiving paintings or photographs, but with the objects themselves. When we see a photo of the Empire State Building or Durer's portrait of Emperor Maximilian, we are faced with a complicated form of intentionality, where our awareness of one entity, the photo or painting, allows us to be aware of another thing, the person or building. We are directed not at that which we perceive, but through it, at something else. In ordinary perception, by contrast, the perceptually given does not function as a sign or picture of something else. Indeed, if Husserl is right, if an object is to function as a picture or sign, we first have to perceive it. Only then can it, in a subsequent step, acquire its representational property. But if this is so, the representational theory of perception obviously has to be rejected. Since it presupposes that which it seeks to explain. What about causality? Is perceptual intentionality not best explained as a form of causal connection between the object of perception and the subject of perception? Could it not be that the causality is the glue that connects mind and world, such that a conscious state can be said to represent, be directed at an object, if and only if it is connected to the object in question by a causal chain? However, this rather crude account faces some obvious difficulties. When I look at a distant hill through binoculars, we would ordinarily say that the object of my perception is the hill. However, although light reflected from the hill might causally affect my visual system, it would certainly not be the only cause, but merely a rather distal one. Why don't I represent the lenses of the binoculars, not to speak of the proximal stimulation of my retina? Man, how many passes is lawnmower person gonna make? I'm not rolling up the window again. Another problem is that the notion of causality seems too coarse-grained to be able to capture the aspectual nature of intentionality. Let us assume that I enter a room and see a woman, lol, a worn brown suitcase. The suitcase will always appear to me in a certain way. I can never see all of the suitcase, front, back, bottom, inside, simultaneously. The suitcase also appears in a particular illumination and against a specific background. It might be assumed that this can all be easily explained by the way the suitcase causally affects my visual system. But we need to remember that the suitcase will also always appear in a specific context with a specific meaning. Depending on my previous experiences and current interests, the exact same suitcase might show itself as a travel equipment, as a container for old letters, as exemplar of the thesis that all spatial objects have a backside, as a souvenir of Ellis Island, or as a symbol of the current refugee crisis. To put it differently, I can relate to the very same suitcase in many different ways, practical as well as theoretical. It is not obvious that the causal impact exerted by the suitcase can account for all these differences. The most troublesome objection to the attempt to reduce intentionality to causality is, however, the following. Real existing spatial objects in my immediate physical surrounding, these things that might causally affect me, only constitute a very small part of what I can be conscious of. I can think about the backside of the moon, about square circles, unicorns next Christmas, or the principle of the non-contradiction. But how are these absent objects, impossible objects, fictive objects, future objects, or ideal objects supposed to affect me causally? The fact that it is possible to think a theory that claims an object must influence me causally if I am to be conscious of it. The fact that it is possible to think about objects which do not exist seems a decisive argument against a theory that claims an object must influence me causally if I am to be conscious of it. Man, it is nice out here. Now I got mosquitoes in my car. Are you a mosquito or are you a fly? Oh, you're a fly, yay. Buzz the frick off. See you later, alligator. On the phenomenological counter-proposal, we are first and foremost directed at real existing objects. The taste of a lemon, the smell of coffee, the coldness of an ice cube are not qualities that belonging to some spurious mental objects, but qualities of the presented objects. We should consequently stop conceiving of perceptual experience as some kind of internal movie screen that confronts us with mental representations. Instead of thinking that objects need to be internally reproduced or represented in order to be experienced, the phenomenologists would argue that perceptual experience presents us with the objects directly and immediately. Rather than saying that we experience representations, and rather than thinking of perceptual intentionality as a form of representation, perception is best thought of as a form of presentation. In addition, we should also give up the idea of trying to explain the mind-world relation in causal terms. Objects in the world interact causally, but the mind is not simply an object, and the peculiar nature of the mind-world relationship cannot be equated with or assimilated to the kind of causal relationship that obtains between two intra-worldly objects. Indeed, to approach the mind as if it was simply yet another object in the world would, according to phenomenologists, prevent one from disclosing, let alone clarifying, some of the most interesting aspects of consciousness, including its true epistemic and ontological significance. As should have become clear by now, the reason why phenomenologists are interested in analyzing the structure of consciousness, of conscious intentionality, is because they want to clarify the relation between mind and world. They are not particularly concerned with the relation between the mind and the brain, and do not share a view that a proper account of intentionality is one that explains it reductively by appeal to non-intentional mechanisms and processes. That's a pretty banger right there. Non-intentional mechanisms of consciousness. Meaning, like a kind of any reduction beyond intentionality as a category would not explain what it is that intentionality is trying to explain. That's cool. So non-intentional mechanisms could be like psychological mechanisms or biological mechanisms or, those kinds of things. Anyway. Phenomenology contends that consciousness is characterized by an intrinsic and underived intentionality, and would argue that meaning rather than causality plays a fundamental role. A stone might hit a window and thereby cause it to crack, but although the two objects are causally related, it doesn't make one conscious of the other. It doesn't make one be about the other. Even if I am causally affected by the cake, when I perceive it, it is not the causation that makes me perceptually aware of the cake. Rather, the cake has meaning for me, and I intend it, am directed at it, by meaning something about it. Mind and world. There is much more to be said about intentionality. What is of importance for the present purpose is the fact that the phenomenologists, by insisting on the intentional character of the mind, want to emphasize its self-transcending character. The mind is not initially and taken on its own a self-enclosed sphere that has to await a causal impact from elsewhere in order to become world-related. It is as misleading to regard the world as somehow outside or external to us as it is to conceive of consciousness as somehow located inside an interior sphere where it merely deals with internal representations of the world. It is as wrong to claim that consciousness must literally get outside of itself in order to reach the world as it is to claim that the mind must somehow absorb or digest the world in order to become aware of it. All of these proposals are equally mistaken, and all fail to realize that consciousness is neither a container nor a special place, but rather to be defined in terms of its openness. We do not at first reside inside an isolated subjective sphere in order, then, to venture out into the world from time to time. Rather, the intentional openness of consciousness is an integral part of its being. Its world-relatedness is part of its nature. A famous passage in Heidegger's Being and Time nicely captures this basic insight. In directing itself outward and in grasping something, Dasein does not first go outside of the inner sphere in which it is initially encapsulated, but rather in its primary kind of being, it is always already outside together with some being encountered in the world already discovered. Nor is any inner sphere abandoned when Dasein dwells together with a being outside together with its object. What the frick? Sorry. Nor is any inner sphere abandoned when Dasein dwells together with a being to be known and determines its character. Nor is any inner sphere abandoned when Dasein dwells together with a being to be known and determines its inner character. Whoa. Oh. Alright. That's cool. Dasein is like, I don't know, world spirit or something. And it's talking about how we're all being to be known and determines its character. So it's saying that we're not, like, getting rid of, like, you know, the inward notion of subjectivity, despite the fact of being in the world, being a being in the being a being in the to be known in the world. I don't know, what the fuck ever. Rather, even in this being outside together with its object, Dasein is inside, correctly understood. That is, it itself exists as the being in the world which knows. Dang. Cool. Heidegger doesn't speak of the intentional subject, or of subjectivity or consciousness, but prefers to use the term Dasein, which is composed of Da, meaning there, and Sein, meaning being, i.e., their being, or being there. This terminological choice is partially motivated by a wish to avoid some of the misleading connotations that come with the traditional terms, and partially in order to emphasize that our very being is to be located in and involved with the world. Indeed, what a phenomenological investigation reveals is that traditional categories such as inner and outer cannot adequately capture the relation between Dasein and world. Since Dasein is always already dwelling among things, it has no outside, which is also why it is nonsensical to talk of it as having an inside. Similar ideas can be found in Husserl, who argues that the facile divide between inside and outside is inappropriate for a proper understanding of intentionality, and that the subject is neither in the world nor outside of it, just as the world is neither in the subject nor outside of it. The very division between inner-outer is precisely one with which phenomenology plays havoc. As Merleau-Ponty puts it, the world is entirely on the inside, and I am entirely outside of myself. That's based. If we for a moment return to pictorial intentionality, the point of the example is not merely to highlight how it differs from perceptual intentionality, but also to show that what might appear as a fairly simple accomplishment, seeing a picture of the Eiffel Tower, actually harbors quite a complex intentional interplay. Normally, we take objects for granted and remain oblivious to our own intentional contribution. But pictures do not simply exist naturally. There would be no pictures in a mindless universe. Objects only come to function as pictures due to a special intentional accomplishment. The radical phenomenological claim is now that this holds true more generally. As Husserl writes in an early text, the objects of which we are conscious are not simply in consciousness, as in a box, so that they can be merely found in it and snatched at in it. They are at first constituted as being what they are for us, and as what they count for as for us, in varying forms of objective intention. In phenomenological texts, the term constitution is a technical one. Constitution doesn't mean creation. Consciousness does not create the objects it constitutes, nor is it at their source, in the sense that they can somehow be deduced from or explained by its operations. It is not as if the fact that water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen rather than helium and xenon is somehow to be explained with reference to consciousness. To speak of constituting consciousness is not to speak of a mind that shapes the world in its own image. Rather, constitution must be understood as a process that allows for the manifestation or appearance of objects and their signification, i.e., it is a process that permits that which is constituted to appear, to manifest, and present itself as what it is. Excuse me. And this process is precisely one that in significant ways involves consciousness. Normally, if we live a life of self-forgetfulness where we are absorbed in worldly events, we focus on the objects. Normally, we live a life of self-forgetfulness where we are absorbed in worldly events. We focus on the object that appears and do not attend to the object as it appears. We do not pause to ask or examine how things can appear to us in the way they do, and with the meaning that they have. But if we really are to philosophically comprehend what it means for something to be a perceived object, a remembered event, a judged state of affairs, we cannot ignore the intentional states, the perceiving, the remembering, and the judging, that reveal these objects to us. Although we tend to ignore the modes of givenness in daily life, the task of phenomenology was from the beginning to break with the naivety of daily life and to call attention to and investigate the correlation between act and object, between cogito and cogitatum. We need to recognize the difference between the intentional experience and the intentional object. But the fact that they are different does not entail that they are not essentially related. A proper phenomenological investigation of intentionality should not merely consider the subjective side, say, the perceptual or emotional experience, but also must investigate their objective correlates, the perceived or desired object. The same holds true in reverse. We cannot analyze the intentional object properly without considering its subjective correlate, the intentional act. A main concern of phenomenology was precisely to account for this relation between the subjective and the objective. For Husserl, the greatest and most important problems in phenomenology were related to the question of how objectivities of different kinds, from the pre-scientific ones to those of the highest scientific dignity, are constituted by consciousness. Indeed, it is therefore a matter of inquiring, in the most comprehensive universality, into how objective unities of any region or category, a region and category, are constituted in the manner peculiar to consciousness. We are now approaching a core feature of phenomenological thinking. The reason for the phenomenological interest in intentionality is not primarily due to a narrow concern with and interest for subjective experiences per se. The argument is rather that if we really wish to understand the status of physical objects, mathematical models, chemical processes, social relations, cultural products, etc., then we need to understand how they can appear as what they are and with the meaning that they have. In order to do that, we also have to consider the subjects for whom they appear. When we encounter perceived, judged, evaluated objects, a thorough philosophical examination of these objects will lead us to the experiential structures that these modes of appearance are correlated with. We will be led to the acts of presentation, perception, judgment, and valuation, and thereby to the subjects that the objects are appearing must necessarily be understood in relation to. By adopting the phenomenological attitude, we thematize the givenness of objects, but we do not simply focus on the objects precisely as they are given. We also focus on the structure of the respective object experience, thereby becoming aware of our subjective accomplishments and of the intentionality that is at play in order for objects to appear as they do. When we investigate appearing objects, we also disclose ourselves as those to whom objects appear. The topic of phenomenological analysis is consequently not a worldless subject, and phenomenology does not ignore the world in favor of consciousness. Rather, phenomenology is interested in consciousness because it is world-disclosing. It is in order to understand how the world can appear in the way it does, and with the validity and meaning it has, that phenomenology comes to investigate the disclosing performance of intentional consciousness. Rather than merely amounting to a limited exploration of the psychological domain, an in-depth investigation of intentionality is taken to pave the way for a proper understanding of reality and objectivity. Indeed, one of the reasons why the theory of intentionality occupies center stage in Husserl's thinking is precisely because he considers a study of the world-directedness of consciousness to provide us with insights into not only the structure of subjectivity, but also into the nature of objectivity. That something like a conscious appropriation of the world is possible does not merely tell us something about consciousness, but also about the world. But of course, this way of discussing consciousness as the constitutive dimension that makes any worldly manifestation possible, as the place in which the world can reveal and articulate itself, is quite different from any attempt to treat it scientifically as merely yet another physical or psychical or physical object in the world. By insisting on the fact that the mind and world must be explored simultaneously, phenomenology offers a perspective that straddles or undermines a traditional distinction between epistemology and ontology. Traditionally, one has distinguished the question of how we come to understand and have knowledge of the world from questions pertaining to the nature of reality. A tempting and easy move is to insist that whereas an answer to the former question might in various ways appeal to and involve subjective and experiential processes, the answer to the latter question has quite deliberately to subtract any subjective contribution we make in order to account for reality from, quote, a view from nowhere, unquote. By focusing on the phenomena, however, phenomenology is at once analyzing our way of understanding and experiencing the world, and at the same time, the objects and their modes of appearance. This is why Heidegger, in Being and Time, can write that ontology is only possible as phenomenology, and that the analysis of our being in the world is key to every ontological exploration. What is a word for that? Ontoepistemology? Or yeah, I think that would be it. Ontoepistemology. More generally speaking, phenomenologists would dispute that the relation between the world and subjectivity is merely accidental, as if the two were like pieces of Lego, which can either hang together or be separated. The lesson of intentionality is that the mind is essentially open and that reality is essentially manifestable. For something to count as real, it must in principle be something that we can encounter, though the mode of encounter can vary. Perceptual acquaintance, practical engagement, and scientific investigation is merely some of the possible forms. To reject this idea, and to claim that the moon, a neuron, a deck of cards, or a communal ritual have an unfathomable and hidden true being, that what they really are is something completely divorced from any context of use, network of meaning, or theoretical framework, and that whatever experiential and theoretical perspective we might adopt on them is consequentially bound to miss its target, is not only a deeply obfuscating claim, but also one that is epistemologically naive. On what basis and from what perspective could such a claim ever be justified? We cannot look sideways at our experiences in order to see to what extent they match with reality. This is so not because such a view is extremely hard to reach, but because the very idea of such a view is nonsensical. Any understanding of reality is by definition perspectival. Effacing our perspective does not bring us any closer to the world, it merely prevents us from understanding anything about the world at all. Let's see how much of this chapter is left. Jeez Louise. Okay. Realism and idealism. By insisting on the interdependence and inseparability of mind and world, phenomenologists are not reducing the world to instrumental modifications or constructions. They are combining the claim that the world is different from the mind and the claim that world is also related to the mind and vice versa. A pregnant formulation of this idea can be found in an early text by Sartre. Husserl persistently affirmed that one cannot dissolve things in consciousness. You see this tree to be sure, but you see it just where it is, at the side of the road, in the midst of the dust, alone and writhing in the heat, 8 miles from the Mediterranean coast. It cannot enter your consciousness, for it is not of the same nature as consciousness. But Husserl is not a realist. This tree on its bit of parched earth is not an absolute that would subsequently enter into communication with me. Consciousness and the world are given at one stroke. Essentially external to consciousness, the world is nevertheless essentially relative to consciousness. The scholarly literature is filled with discussions of whether such a view makes phenomenology committed to a form of philosophical idealism. Levinas once remarked that Husserl's idealism is not a theory about how the subject is closed in upon itself and only knows its own states, but a theory about how the subject, qua intentional, is open to everything. Much depends on the definitions used. If one defines idealism as the view that the subject is only aware of its own subjective states, and if realism geez Louise, is then the view that we are directly aware of objects in the world, objects with a totally different kind of being than the mind, Husserl might be more of a realist than a traditional idealist. As previously noted, however, there is no question that the phenomenologists are opposed to objectivism, i.e., to the view that reality is what it is completely independently of any experiencer, and that our cognitive apprehension of reality is, at best, a faithful mirroring of a pre-existing world. This is not only Husserl's view. Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty both deny the self-contained nature of mind and argue that it is intrinsically world-involved. Uno minuto. Hi, yeah. World-involved. In addition, however, they also defend the reverse claim and argue that the world is tied to the mind. To put it differently, both of them would argue that the relation between mind and world is an internal relation, a relation constitutive of its relata, and not an external one of causality. As Heidegger writes in the lecture course, The Basic Problems of Phenomenology from 1927, world exists, that is, it is, only if Dasein exists, only if there is Dasein. Only if world is there, if Dasein exists as being in the world, is their understanding of being, and only if this understanding exists, are intraworldly beings unveiled as extant and handy. World understanding is Dasein understanding, is self-understanding. Self and world belong together in the single entity, the Dasein. Self and world are not two beings, like subject and object, or like I and thou. But self and world are the basic determination of Dasein itself and the unity of the structure of being in the world. A similar commitment to the interdependence of mind and world is found in Merleau-Ponty, who towards the end of Phenomenology of Perception declares that the world is inseparable from the subject, but from a subject who is nothing but a proper project of the world, and the subject is inseparable from the world, but from a world that itself projects. The subject is being in the world, and the world remains subjective, since its texture and its articulations are sketched out by the subject's movement of transcendence. The focus of phenomenology is on the intersection between mind and world, neither of which can be understood in separation from each other. We are what we are as a function of our world involvement, and the world understood as the fundamental context of meaning, as also only what it is because of our involvement with it. To ask what one is without the other is like asking what a background is in itself, independently of the foreground. Notes, this sounds funny. If one gets too absorbed when watching a horror movie, this might happen. Importantly, however, the specific aesthetic attitude requires that the distinction between fiction and reality is maintained. The spectator, who is so absorbed and enthralled by a performance of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet that he calls out for a doctor when he sees Romeo drink the poison, has missed something essential. Alright. Let's see, suggestions. Intentionality without representationalism. Dang. Stuff looks good. After reading Merleau-Ponty criticize Sartre's takes on subjectivity, I don't know if Sartre's takes on intentionality would be the best. Although, apparently Mr. Zahavi is telling me they're frickin' good. So, probably should read that. Alright, well, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry if the video is scuffed and for the frickin' lawnmowers. It was nice getting to read. Have a good night. I need to come up with some kind of, like, catchphrase. What do we got? Alright, well, I got nothing. Nothing for you, at least. Bye.